July 2nd, 1971, 6 p.m. For the past 4 months, Jim Morrison has been hiding out in a rented apartment in Paris, on the run from his rock idol image and trying to establish himself as a serious poet. He spent the day with his old friend Alain René. It will be the last day they ever spend together. In 11 hours, Jim Morrison will be dead. When René tells Morrison that he has to leave for a dinner engagement, the singer begs him to go out with him for one more drink. Morrison may have turned his back on his public, but he's not ready to be entirely left alone.
You know, there's a great quote about fame that says, it's not satisfying, but it's addictive. And that's true. What happens is you get used to that attention. Jim was very used to that attention. So in Paris, not having as much of it, I'm sure there was a little bit of loneliness, a little bit of isolation.
But in 1969, as a member of The Doors, Jim Morrison was still very much the center of attention, in all the wrong ways. Although his band was as big as the Beatles and Bob Dylan, his drinking and antisocial behavior was now completely out of control. It drove a wedge between him and the other members of The Doors. But instead of toning down his wild ways,
cigarette?
He blamed his problems on his rock god image, manufactured for his fans. And on one particularly hot night in Miami in 1969, Morrison crossed another line, this time driving a wedge between himself and the people that had made him a star, his public.
Jim had been drinking. He had seen a stage performance in Los Angeles the night before where the whole cast was nude. And I think he decided to test some limits.
As if to mock his sexy image, Morrison removed his shirt, threatening next to take off his trousers.
Now Ray, knowing Jim's unpredictability, knowing that Jim had been drinking, said to me, "Vince, don't let Jim take his pants off." I put my fingers in his belt loops and I put my arms against my hips and lifted. In fact, it's a wonder his voice didn't go up an octave.
Taking their cue from Morrison, the audience stripped down to the buff.
The audience followed suit, where more than 50% of the audience was actually naked.
The authorities were not amused.
Crime Commission, I'm calling upon the Dade County Grand Jury and the State Attorney's Office to immediately take criminal action against the group known as the Doors, and we are demanding that action this day.
A few days after the show, they charged Morrison with lewd and lascivious behavior, a felony, even though many claim he never removed his trousers.
The guys couldn't tell. They were looking at their instruments, and Jim doesn't remember whether he did or he didn't.
I am willing to state here unequivocally, Jim did not in any way, shape, or manner take his pants down, open his pants up, or expose himself in any way. It was physically impossible for him to do it.
But whether he did or not, he was of special interest to the FBI, who'd been keeping close tabs on him for quite a while. They saw Jim Morrison as a menace to society.
In research for my book, I obtained the FBI files on Jim Morrison. Now, a lot of that is blacked out, but suffice it to say that the FBI was definitely interested in Jim Morrison, monitored his activity, and had him on a watch list.
The FBI's interest in Morrison was maybe less about public nudity and more about his anti-war lyrics on songs like Peace Frog and The Unknown Soldier.
I think also in Jim's lyrics, the fact that he called for revolution regularly, the fact that, you know, he was pushing people to the idea of a revolution. In Jim's mind, I think it really wasn't a conscious, social, organized revolution. It was more an individual revolution of breaking away from the conditioning of society and your parents and trying to come to a new and different reality on your own. And Jim was all about that.
If political means upending society and changing rules and fomenting different kinds of revolution, then the Doors and Jim Morrison were absolutely political.
But in July 1971, as a rock and roll exile in Paris, Jim Morrison seems hardly a threat to anyone but himself. As he drinks with Alain René near Place de la Bastille, an enduring symbol of the French Revolution, the only rebellion brewing is the one that's violently raging through Morrison's body. His attacks suggest he's suffering from acute respiratory distress.
He had had difficulty lately. He had spit up blood a few times. He had had some other problems, respiratory problems. Some of this went back to an injury he had jumping out the window at the Chateau Marmot in L.A. and doing a Tarzan act off a drain pipe and then falling and smashing off the shed of the place and injuring himself.
Morrison should be looked after in a hospital. Instead, he's busy ordering yet another beer. His friend, Elaine Renee, announces that he has to leave to meet a friend. They will never see one another again. In just 10 hours, Jim Morrison will dabble in more than just alcohol, and it will cost him his life. Shortly after Elaine Renee leaves, Jim meets up with his girlfriend, Pamela Courson. To the outside world, they look like a typical couple in love, out for a stroll in one of the most romantic cities in the world. But since first meeting back in 1966, their relationship has been anything but typical. The pair first met at a club on Sunset Strip called the London Fog, where the Doors were the house band. Morrison called her his cosmic mate and dedicated poetry and songs to her.
And that remained constant and genuine. It did not, however, in the process, make him monogamous.
Jim's wayward ways got him in trouble when he was caught red-handed with rock groupie Pamela Des Barres.
I was a cute young girl, and it was 1967. It was Laurel Canyon, and Jim Morrison was next door, and it was really, you know, a very exciting moment. So I walked in, and there was Jim. And he turned around to me and he said, "Whoa, get it on." That's what he said a lot of times. He said, "Get it on," instead of hello. And so I was like naked there on his floor, and he was leaning over me. And just as that was going on, Pam walked in. She has good timing. So she promptly kicked me out.
Beautiful and strong-willed, Pamela Courson didn't take Morrison's infidelity lying down. Their fights were the stuff of legend.
Their relationship was very wild, tempestuous. They pushed off against each other. There was a lot of, wild fights and things like that.
To buffer the fighting, they kept separate homes. Morrison stayed at a motel near the Doors' headquarters, while Pam lived at a house on Laurel Canyon, immortalized in the Doors' song Love Street. In their own strange way, they had found love.
And I don't think they ever really thought about being with somebody else on a permanent basis. I think that, they knew that they were the love of each other's lives, and they would always come back together.
But for all the comfort that Pamela brought her boyfriend, she had her own demons. A nasty addiction to heroin, for one. Many thought her unstable and a bad influence on an already troubled Jim Morrison.
She was a junkie. In fact, was the cause of a lot of stress and fighting and arguing with Jim and a lot of his drinking. She was probably the worst influence on his life.
But tonight, as they make their way into a Paris movie theater, they're the picture of domestic bliss. They've come to see a film recommended by their friend, Elaine Renee.
Renee suggested that he go see Pursuit, a movie that starred Robert Mitchum, and Jim liked Robert Mitchum. So he went. He wasn't that impressed with it from what Pam said later, but, it was all right.
But in 7 hours' time, nothing will be quite all right. The young couple's domestic bliss will turn to tragedy, and the world of rock and roll will lose one of its brightest lights. July 3rd, 1971, 1 a.m. For the last 4 months, rock star Jim Morrison has called Paris home. He's come here to write and to rest, but his stay has been anything but restful. He's made himself increasingly sick by indulging in a steady diet of whiskey and beer. And tonight, in his apartment with his cosmic mate Pamela Courson, he decides to go even further. He takes heroin. Up to now, Morrison's entourage has worked very hard to keep the hard stuff well away.
I don't tolerate smack, pure and simple. So everybody knew that it could be dangerous to them to bring that stuff out. Uncle Tony will not be amused. Somebody's going to get hurt. Guaranteed.
But tonight, Uncle Tony is thousands of miles away, and no one's there to look out for Jim.
Over the years, Pam got involved in different kinds of things and eventually started using heroin. Now, this was something Jim was concerned about. It's not something he condoned. It's not something he really approved of. That night, whether it was just the idea of something he wanted to try, just pushing the envelope, whether it was some depression, he had been very reflective lately, whatever, he tried the heroin.
That decision will prove to be fatal. Stoned out of their minds, Pam and Jim watch home movies of recent vacations. Between reels, they snort more heroin and spin some old Doors records. But in just 3 hours, the music will be over. Before his exile to Paris, Morrison had been forced to face a different kind of music, felony charges stemming from the Miami concert. So severe were those charges that they deeply affected the band, and, as usual, it was all about Jim.
Well, in the realm of art and theater, I do think that there should be complete freedom for the artist and performer.
Everybody's nerves were on edge. Would he behave? In many places, police were there with a warrant for Jim's arrest. In fact, for the arrest of the whole group, if he so much sneezed the wrong way.
Booking stopped. Concert promoters no longer wanted to have them because of the fear of arrests and lawsuits and violence and mayhem and breaking obscenity laws.
Jim Morrison and the Doors were not prepared for the backlash that followed.
Radio shows would not play Doors records. Doors recordings were removed from the shelves of record stores. We were absolutely banned from all public media.
Once the darling of the press, Jim Morrison became public enemy #1. He was ridiculed by Rolling Stone magazine with a wanted poster that called the Miami concert Jim's organ recital.
When people started looking at him as a drunken fool, that devastated him. Basically, you know, Jim wanted to be wild and crazy on stage. He did not want to be seen as a fool.
But worse was to come. In September 1970, after awaiting trial for nearly 2 years, James Douglas Morrison was found guilty and sentenced to 60 days hard labor for profanity and 6 months hard labor for indecent exposure. Allowed to remain free on bail pending an appeal, Morrison, the free-spirited bohemian, was terrified of doing time. In his darkest hour, he became increasingly obsessed with his own mortality.
Then when Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin died, Jim began to go around and say he was number 3. Jim was always saying things like that.
On July 3rd, 1971, in his apartment in Paris, Jim Morrison is well on his way to becoming the next rock and roll casualty. At 3:30 a.m., after passing out on the couch from too much heroin, his girlfriend, Pamela Courson, wakes up to find him struggling to breathe. She manages to rouse him. She wants to call a doctor, but Morrison refuses. Pamela, still high from the heroin, goes off to bed. Jim Morrison isn't ready to join her quite yet. Instead, he heads to the washroom where he draws himself a hot bath. It will be the last thing he ever does. Seven months earlier, back in the States and with serious jail time hanging over his head, Morrison became ever more distant from those around him. In concert, he was barely able to perform. In December 1970, on stage in New Orleans, the Lizard King completely fell apart.
He stood up, picked up the microphone stand, and proceeded to smash it through the floor, literally smash a hole in the floor. He then walked off the side of the stage right, went up to the dressing room. That was the end of it.
For years, the other members had put up with Morrison's antics, but this time he'd gone too far. Drummer John Densmore had seen enough.
John tossed his sticks on the floor and said, "That's it, never again." The decision was, we will never perform in public again. We will never go on stage again.
But while they'd never play together live again, the Doors continued to record. They began work on their 6th album, LA Woman. But recording alone was not enough for Jim.
He lived on performing. How else could he get the word out about what he thought if he didn't tour? How else was he going to get his message across? How else was he going to be able to bring the gospel of St. Jim to the crowd?
I think he began to think, well, I've got to get my life together. Maybe going to Paris, I can come up with some new things. I can define myself more as a poet. I can get away from the things causing me trouble, and, I'll start anew.
But if Morrison's move to Paris was the beginning of anything, it was the beginning of the end. At 4 a.m. on July 3rd, 1971, his girlfriend, Pamela Courson, wakes to the sound of Morrison throwing up in the washroom. Sick to his stomach, he's throwing up blood. Again, Morrison refuses to call the doctor. When his nausea finally passes, he tells her to go back to bed, that he will soon join her. But he never quite makes it. Instead, Jim Morrison slips quietly into unconsciousness. Paris, July 3rd, 1971, 6 a.m. As the city slowly comes to life, Pamela Courson suddenly wakes up. The night before, she and her boyfriend, Jim Morrison, partied the night away, snorting heroin. And now, she wonders why he never made it back to bed. She finds him passed out in the bathtub. His nose and mouth are crusted with blood. She tries to wake him, but he doesn't move.
And at first, she thought he might be joking around with her because he did stuff like this all the time. So she stayed in there and watched, and he didn't move. He didn't move.
Because she can't speak French fluently, she feels unable to call an ambulance. Instead, she phones Jim's best friend in Paris, Alain René, and asks him to call one for her. Before the medics get there, fireman Alain Raison arrives.
When we entered the bathroom, I saw the body of a man, the head thrown back. The water, it was just a little bit pink, because I think he must have bled.
The rescuers have no idea that their patient is, in fact, Jim Morrison.
The water was warm, so the body was also warm, which led us to presume that maybe he was not dead.
They rush Morrison's still warm body out of the tub to discover he's only warm because of the tepid bathwater.
Very quickly, we became aware that, in fact, he was dead.
The time of death is estimated at around 5 a.m. The death certificate states that he died of apparent heart failure. Citing no foul play, the authorities see no reason for an investigation or to order an autopsy. Jim Morrison, one of the most important singers of his era, is dead at 27. Many do not buy the ending to the Jim Morrison story, leading to a flurry of mysterious theories. Some say that before Pam Courson called Elaine Ronay about an ambulance, she called her heroin dealer, who came to the apartment and advised Pam to flush the drugs. Soon after, that same dealer hightailed it out to Marrakesh to avoid legal hassles. Others say that Jim had been out partying the night before he died at a Paris nightclub, where he OD'd in their bathroom. Fearing being tied to his death, the nightclub had Morrison's body carried back to his apartment and dumped in the bathtub. Others still believe Morrison staged his own death and is still alive somewhere, having finally escaped the image that had troubled him so.
You know, there's all this talk about Jim faking his own death, and he promoted those rumors because he talked about doing it, because Rimbaud had done that and had disappeared and wrote his great works, you know, up to when he was 18, 19, and then disappeared into Africa, and that's what Jim Morrison talked about doing.
I always thought the real testimony to his mystique was the fact that so many people believed maybe he hadn't really died.
One of the greatest, I think, proofs that he didn't fake his own death is the fact that, could Jim Morrison stay out of the spotlight 40 years? I don't think so. Not the Jim Morrison that I've learned he was.
Jim Morrison is buried in Père-Lachaise Cemetery in Paris, not far from Henri de Balzac, Marcel Proust, and Oscar Wilde. Every year, thousands of fans continue to visit his gravesite.
It had been really important to him to be known as something more than this rock icon, this so-called Lizard King. And I wrote the obituary at Rolling Stone. I thought, why not issue the rock thing on the headline and have him go out as what he wanted to be known as, James Douglas Morrison, poet.